Do not look away. This message finding you at this precise moment is not an act of a random algorithm. It is a divine subpoena. The cosmos is about to unseal the indictment on the greatest spiritual crime ever committed against you. And what you are about to hear will not only validate every silent scream of your soul, but will expose the profound and horrifying anatomy of why it all happened. The most egregious acts of evil are never committed in the dark. They are staged under the brightest spotlights, with a broad smile, by the very people who swear they have your back. There was something sickeningly theatrical in the way they orchestrated your takedown. Not quietly, not with any discretion, but with a loud, deliberate, and arrogant cruelty, as if destroying an innocent soul would earn them a standing ovation in the deepest pits of hell. They wanted an audience for your pain. They wanted applause for your demise. Let's anchor ourselves in one immutable truth, a principle confirmed by both psychological studies and spiritual law. Human beings are 4 times more likely to believe a charismatic, well-spoken liar than a quiet, consistent truth-teller. Guess which one you were? You were the quiet truth-teller. The one who showed up when no one else would, who did the right thing when everyone else was cutting corners, who loved with an open heart and gave from the bottom of your soul. And for your purity, for your goodness, you were metaphorically burned at the stake, cast as the villain in their cruel and twisted fairy tale. And the most infuriating part of it all, they knew, deep down, in that quiet, cobwebbed corner of their spirit they keep locked away, they knew you were innocent. They knew your heart was pure. They simply didn't care because casting you as the villain made for a much more compelling and self-serving story. People love to say that the truth always comes out, as if it's some gentle bedtime story for the wounded. But the real truth, the raw and unfiltered truth, usually arrives late to the party, enraged, clutching a thick stack of receipts, and ready to blow up the entire group chat with irrefutable proof. And that is where we are now. The same individuals who smirked while you wept, who orchestrated your public humiliation like it was a team sport, are now stumbling, sweating, and desperately grasping for excuses. Why? Because the world is finally waking up. People are starting to see that you were innocent all along, and that what was done to you wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a vile, premeditated, and spiritually bankrupt act of evil. So let's talk about it. It's time to pull off the masks, rewrite the script, and finally scream what should have been said from the very beginning. And be warned, if you are easily triggered by the blinding light of truth, this may not be the message for you. But if you are ready to witness what divine vindication truly looks like, buckle up. The show is about to begin. 1. They demonized your purity because it exposed their filth. The first and most fundamental truth you must absorb is that they hated you not because you were wrong, but because you were profoundly, undeniably, and inconveniently right. In a world of meticulously constructed personas and manipulative masks, you had the audacity to be real. You didn't feel the need to perform, to posture, or to pretend to be something you were not. You walked into rooms with your head held high, not out of arrogance, but because your conscience was clean and your soul was holy, fiercely intact. And that is precisely what infuriated them to their very core. Your entire existence became a silent judgment on their choices. You owed nobody an explanation for being a decent, honest person, yet your very decency acted as a spotlight that illuminated their own hidden filth. The way you treated people with fairness, integrity, and genuine care made them deeply uncomfortable. Not because you were doing too much, but because they knew, deep down, that they were doing far too little. You weren't actively trying to outshine anyone. In fact, you likely spent most of your time just trying to find peace and avoid conflict. But your mere presence, your authentic energy, highlighted everything they had willingly sacrificed long ago: their integrity, their dignity, and their honesty. They had gleefully traded truth for applause. They had surrendered their principles for a fleeting moment of popularity. They had systematically built their entire lives around an intricate web of manipulation, falsehoods, and disguises. And then you walked in. No performance, no gimmicks, just you, raw, authentic, and unapologetic. To them, it was an offensive sight. You became the mirror they never wanted to look into. So, rather than dealing with the cracks, the decay, and the emptiness they saw reflected back, they tried to shatter the mirror and then blame it for the reflection. It was far easier to label you as arrogant than to face their own gnawing insecurity. It was more convenient to call you naive than to admit to their own cynicism and corruption. They desperately wanted to believe you were a fraud. They needed to believe that you were secretly hiding some terrible darkness. Because if a person could endure what you endured and still carry so much light, what possible excuse did they have for becoming the monsters they had become in the name of survival? You were the silent, living proof that a soul can remain pure even after walking through the most hellish of storms. And that simple, powerful reality drove them absolutely mad. They needed you to fall. They craved your destruction from behind their fake smiles and hollow compliments. And when it didn't happen naturally, they knew they would have to engineer it. That's what makes their betrayal so profoundly twisted. You weren't even in a competition with them. You were just being. But in a world full of people obsessed with dominance, optics, and control, your quiet, unassuming innocence was making far too much noise. It was shattering the fragile illusions upon which they had built their entire identities. So they had to make you their enemy. Not because you were evil, but because you forced them to confront the evil within themselves. They didn't just attack a person. They attacked a living, breathing reminder that purity can still exist in this dark and jaded world. And they simply could not tolerate it. 2. They chose character assassination because real evidence didn't exist. This is where their desperation became blindingly obvious. They couldn't find any actual dirt on you, so they had to manufacture it out of thin air. That is how pathetic and single-minded their mission became. When they scoured your life, past and present, and came up with no proof, no scandal, no smoking gun, a rational person would have stood down. But they were not rational. They were possessed by a dark obsession. So they didn't retreat, they doubled down. The truth was not on their side. So they decided to invent a lie so potent, so insidious, that it could do the damage that facts never could. They made it convincing. Oh, they were masters of the craft. They cloaked their lies in feigned compassion, sighing as they told others how worried they were about you. They skillfully twisted the timeline of events, deliberately omitting key details that would have instantly exonerated you. They would take a kernel of truth, an actual event or conversation, and warp it into something unrecognizable and monstrous. They included just enough factual information in their narrative to make the entire toxic concoction seem plausible to the undiscerning ear. This is the textbook definition of character assassination. It doesn't require evidence. It only requires volume and repetition. And they understood this perfectly. They didn't want people to think. They wanted people to feel anger, suspicion, contempt, or mistrust towards you. Anything that would poison the well and turn the court of public opinion against you before you even knew you were on trial. So they planted seeds of doubt in casual conversations. They would murmur your name in connection to some vague controversy. They would ask leading, innocent questions like, "Don't you think it's a little strange how they always?" Knowing full well the malicious intent behind their words. They couldn't confront you directly, face to face, because you had done nothing wrong, and a direct confrontation would have exposed them as the liars they are. Your clean hands infuriated them to no end. The fact that you had nothing to hide was the greatest obstacle to their smear campaign. So, instead of exposing a secret they couldn't find, they were forced to invent a story. What is even more tragic is how quickly and eagerly people bought it. Not because the lie made any logical sense, but because lies, especially juicy and dramatic ones, travel much faster than the often boring and complex truth. You became a topic of gossip, a whispered rumor, a punchline. And the same people who once smiled to your face and called you a friend began to side-eye you in the hallways, their minds polluted by a narrative they never once bothered to fact-check. They didn't know for sure, but someone with just enough charisma and influence had said the wrong thing at the right time. It was never about discovering the truth. It was about seizing control. They wanted to control the narrative, to control how people saw you, to control how you were treated, and to control whether your name was spoken with respect or dragged through the mud. And the fastest, most efficient way to do that was not through honesty, but through pure, unadulterated manipulation. The worst part was that most people didn't care if it was true. They just wanted to be part of the drama. But here is the magnificent, cosmic law they forgot. The truth does not panic. It does not scream for attention. It waits. And when their carefully woven web of lies begins to unravel and snap, they are faced with the horrifying realization that they didn't just lie about you. They exposed themselves. 3. You were the scapegoat for their own internal rot. They treated you like a human dumping ground, not because you deserved it, but because you were the safest and most convenient place for them to unload their own venom. You became the emotional and spiritual trash receptacle for people who refused to take accountability for their own brokenness, their own failures, and their own misery. Every toxic emotion they were unwilling to process, their suffocating guilt, their corrosive shame, their boiling rage, their green-eyed envy, their deep-seated self-hatred, they projected it all onto you, as if it were your sacred duty to carry their burdens. They were the ones who were hurting, but instead of seeking healing, they decided to inflict pain. Instead of doing the hard inner work, they outsourced it all to you, and then had the audacity to call you too sensitive or too emotional when the weight of it all finally started to crush you. You weren't their problem, you were just available. You were the one who always listened without judgment, who cared too much, who extended a hand when they were in need. But this fatal flaw in their character meant that when they needed someone to blame, you were still standing there, steady and empathetic. So, you became the target. It was sickeningly convenient. You were scapegoated for issues that had absolutely nothing to do with you. If they felt insecure about their own accomplishments, they attacked your confidence. If they felt guilty about their own deceptive behavior, they preemptively called you judgmental to discredit you. If they were seething with anger at themselves for their own poor choices, they lashed out at you with unprovoked rage. It was never, ever about you. It was always about the darkness they couldn't stand to face within themselves. They couldn't admit that they were the toxic ones, that they were the manipulators, that they were the source of the chaos. So they needed to project that role onto someone else, and they chose someone kinder, more compassionate, and less likely to retaliate with the same venom. And that person was you. They counted on your silence. They banked on your bottomless compassion. They effectively weaponized your own empathy against you. And the more of their pain they could project onto you, the lighter and more justified they felt. And you? You carried it all. You absorbed their poison, wondering why you always felt so exhausted, so anxious, so vaguely guilty for things that were never yours to carry in the first place. What they did was more than just unfair. It was a profound act of emotional and spiritual abuse. They didn't just treat you like a trash can. They treated your entire soul as if it were disposable. And now that people are waking up and seeing what happened, the picture is getting very grim for them. Because the same people who so expertly played the victim are now being exposed for what they really are. Cowardly manipulators who poured their own internal rot on as someone too pure to throw it back. You were never the problem. You were the mirror. And they smashed it because they couldn't stand the sight of themselves. Allow that truth to settle deep into your spirit before we continue. You are not alone in this experience. There is an entire army of anointed ones who have walked this path of fire and betrayal. If this message is speaking to you on a soul level, consider subscribing to Wisdom Vision. This is more than just a channel. It is a sanctuary for truth tellers and light bearers. By subscribing, you are planting a flag and declaring that you stand with the truth. 4. Your innocence wasn't just misunderstood, it was deliberately targeted. Let's erase any ambiguity right now. They were not guessing. They were not mistaken or confused. They knew who you were. They saw how you moved through the world, with a quiet strength, with an integrity that refused to bend for convenience, and with a spirit that did not break under pressure. And that is precisely what triggered their assault. This was not a case of ignorance. It was a campaign of intent. They weren't perplexed by your character. They were deeply offended by it. Your purity, your unwavering honesty, and your resolute refusal to play dirty and get down in the mud with them made them feel exposed and inferior. So they put a target on your back. You didn't do anything wrong. You simply refused to become like them. They couldn't control you, and in their worldview, that is the most dangerous quality a person can possess. You weren't motivated by the same things that drove them, not by fear, not by a desperate need for validation, not by the fickle applause of the crowd. You didn't play on people's egos to get ahead. You didn't shrink yourself to keep a false peace. You didn't manufacture friendships for networking or chase clicks for a hollow sense of importance. That kind of spiritual freedom is deeply unsettling to those who rely on manipulation and intimidation to maintain their power. Your authenticity shattered their entire paradigm of control, their twisted system where they get to decide who rises and who falls, who is accepted and who is outcast, who receives love and who is left in the cold. But you, magnificent soul, had no need for their broken system. You refused to play their ugly game, and for that, they hated you with a quiet ferocity. So they didn't just misunderstand you, they actively targeted you. They poked and prodded, hoping to get a reaction. They provoked and schemed, trying to bait you into becoming the monster they claimed you already were. They twisted your words until they were unrecognizable. They weaponized your kindness, painting it as a deceptive strategy. They desperately tried to turn your greatest strengths into perceived weaknesses, because they believed that if they could successfully assassinate your character, if they could tarnish your good name, they would regain the power they felt they lost the moment you refused to bow. It was never about what you did. It was about what you didn't do. You didn't conform. You didn't play along with their deception. You didn't allow their toxic tactics to shape or change you. That, in their minds, made you untouchable, at least spiritually. But here is the most bizarre aspect of their psychology. They recognized your light enough to fear it, but not enough to protect it. Instead of cherishing the rare and beautiful thing they saw in you, their immediate instinct was to try and extinguish it. They didn't want others to see what they saw, because if other people saw your undeniable truth and purity, the entire fake, fragile empire they had built on lies and manipulation would crumble to dust. You weren't targeted because you were flawed. You were targeted because you were real. And in a world full of people hiding behind masks, being authentic is the single greatest threat of all. 5. They needed you to be guilty, because if you were innocent, they were monsters. This is the psychological linchpin of their entire deception. They needed you to be guilty. It was a non-negotiable prerequisite for their own psychological survival. They had to believe it, even if it meant twisting the narrative into a pretzel of lies and contradictions. Because if you were completely, undeniably, and utterly innocent, then everything they did to you was monstrous and inexcusable. Every lie they told, every social trap they set, every smear campaign they launched, and every act of betrayal they committed, all of it would serve as irrefutable evidence that they were not just mistaken, but vicious, calculating, and cruel. And their fragile, bloated egos could never handle the weight of that horrifying truth. So, rather than facing their own darkness, they constructed an alternate reality, a carefully curated narrative where your suffering was not only necessary, but justified. They had to do it. Otherwise, they would be forced to look in the mirror and see themselves for what they truly are. It was never about the facts. It was never about logic or reason. It was about narrative control. You were a problem they refused to solve. You were a truth they wanted to erase. And the easiest, most efficient way to erase someone's truth is to completely reinvent their character. So they began their sinister work. They spun your healthy boundaries into acts of contempt. They interpreted your guarded silence as an admission of guilt. They painted your necessary withdrawal from their toxicity as arrogance. They systematically built a case where you were the crazy, unstable villain, and they were just poor, innocent souls trying to cope with your alleged destructive behavior. It was a masterful performance, worthy of an award. But it was more than just a performance. It was strategic warfare. They would put on their most convincing victim faces in public while silently and methodically plunging daggers in your back in rooms you weren't even allowed to enter. They would cry to others about how you had wounded them, just loudly enough to drown out any whispers of contradictory evidence. Because they knew that if people looked too closely, if they started asking the right questions, the masks would slip. And what was behind those masks? Not hurt, not confusion, but pure, cold calculation. Envy, a thirst for control, crippling insecurity. But they couldn't afford that kind of exposure. So you had to take the fall. You had to be the bad guy so they could keep wearing the halos they never earned. This is the subtle nature of evil that hides in plain sight, cloaked in charm and feigned concern. It doesn't roar and rage. It whispers and manipulates. It doesn't push you off a cliff. It gently convinces you to walk to the edge on your own. And it will do anything to avoid accountability. Because accountability means admitting that you were the target, not the threat. And that simple truth would completely demolish the carefully polished public image they have worked so hard to maintain. You weren't the villain. You were the reflection. And they couldn't stand what they saw. So they painted you black so they could feel white again. But now, the paint is chipping. The rain of divine justice is washing it all away. And the truth? It's getting very, very loud. We are in a spiritual war, and messages like this are our ammunition. The work we do at Wisdom Vision is a sacred mission to arm the anointed with truth and clarity. If you feel called to be a part of our mission, to help us grow and create more content that breaks chains and exposes darkness, please consider making a $10 donation to our ministry using the Super Thanks button below this video. Every single donation helps us fight this good fight. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and share this video. Your act of support could be the very thing that pulls someone else out of the dark. 6. You posed a threat to the hierarchy of hypocrisy. The moment you refused to play by their unwritten, hypocritical rules, you became a problem. Not because you were confrontational or rude, but simply because you were authentic in a system that thrives on deceit. You walked into their carefully constructed social ecosystem, their pyramid of fakeness, and you didn't bow. You didn't immediately start trying to impress the right people. You didn't engage in their toxic power games. You didn't placate egos, grovel for validation, or stay silent when something was morally wrong just to keep your seat at their wobbly table. And this made you profoundly dangerous to them, because someone like you exposes the entire charade without even trying. Their whole social structure was built on sand, where status mattered more than substance, and perception mattered more than integrity. It was an intricate game based on who you knew, how well you could play a role, and how much of your soul you were willing to sell for acceptance. And then you showed up, not asking for permission to exist, not begging for inclusion. And yet, you shone. Your light, which emanated from an internal, divine source, disrupted everything. Because in their world, you weren't supposed to be able to stand tall without their approval. You weren't supposed to have a voice unless they agreed with what you were saying. But you spoke anyway. You stood anyway. You rose on the merits of your authenticity alone. And it shook them to their core. They hid behind their job titles, their social circles, their fake smiles, and their shared secrets. But you needed none of it. You didn't gossip to get ahead. You didn't lie to fit in. You didn't operate one way in public and then become someone else entirely in private. And that consistency terrified them. Because a person who cannot be bribed, bought, intimidated, or broken is a massive threat to any system built on fear and manipulation. You weren't supposed to be this strong. You weren't supposed to be this free. You weren't supposed to be you, not without their express permission. And when they realized they couldn't control you, they tried to neutralize you by labeling you. They called you difficult, too intense, too honest, not a team player. But none of it stuck, because you were never interested in fitting into their broken box in the first place. You were too busy being true to yourself, and that was something they could not handle. You didn't threaten their physical safety, you threatened their lies. You didn't want to tear down their world. Your integrity just revealed how fake and fragile it was. You didn't challenge their authority. Your very presence challenged their entire foundation. And as other people began to see the stark contrast between what was real, you, and what was not, them, their entire structure began to tremble. 7. They used collective gaslighting to turn your sanity into a suspect. They knew they couldn't take you down alone. Your integrity and character were too solid. So they assembled a mob. This is the dark magic of group gaslighting. It's not just one person distorting reality. It's an entire network of people amplifying the same lie until it begins to echo and sound like a plausible truth. Their goal was not just to confuse you, but to confuse everyone around you. Because as long as people were questioning you, they wouldn't be questioning them. That was the diabolical strategy. Twist the script so completely that the innocent party looks guilty, while the guilty parties walk away looking clean, often playing the part of sympathetic victims. They started with small, subtle jabs. Little comments dropped into conversation like poison darts. Don't you think they're a little too nice? There's just something about them I can't quite put my finger on. I don't know, the whole situation just feels off. These statements were never backed by facts. They were insidious seeds planted to cultivate suspicion and unease. And as they and their recruits repeated them, more and more people started to wonder if there was something to it. Because when enough people are murmuring the same doubt, the casual listener starts to believe it must be true. Your kindness was reframed as a deceptive strategy. Your honesty was twisted and presented as aggression. Your silence, which was nothing more than your attempt to protect your peace from their toxic onslaught, became the primary evidence they used to paint you as cold, distant, or guilty. They masterfully took every good and pure thing about you and turned it into a weapon to be used against you. This is how manipulation hides in plain sight. They didn't have evidence, but they had volume. They didn't have integrity, but they had numbers. And in our society, people have a tendency to trust the loudest voices over the most truthful ones. You started to feel like you were losing your mind, trapped in a strange, upside-down world where nothing made sense. A world where the more honest you were, the more you were suspected. A world where no matter what you said, your words could and would be twisted against you. That feeling is not paranoia. That is the intended outcome of psychological warfare. That is precisely what happens when a group of people conspire to rewrite your reality. Not because you are unstable, but because your stability is a massive threat to their own. The most incredible part of it all is that none of it was accidental. It was deliberate. It was orchestrated. It was maintained and rehearsed. Because they knew, deep down, that if people saw you clearly, if they truly paid attention to your consistent character, your steady spirit, and your compassionate heart, the entire web of lies they had woven would fall apart. So they did everything in their power to fog up the lens, to muddy the waters, and to make you question the very light you carry. But the fog is clearing now, and the truth is shining through, brighter and more powerfully than ever before.